More than 150 gospel artists walked into a Nashville venue on a quiet evening, with no cameras set up, no announced agenda, and no press anywhere in the building, because Bill Gaither had called each of them personally and asked them to come. That alone tells you something about the man, and something about what this night was going to mean. What they chose to sing together, what Gaither said before anyone played a single note, and why more than a dozen people in that room were already in tears before the music started. That is the story this video is going to tell you, from beginning to end. But to understand what that moment really meant, you have to go back to 1965, when a young schoolteacher from Alexandria, Indiana, sat down and wrote a song that nobody thought would last. And what you find there changes everything about how we see Bill Gaither. Before we go any further, if you love the untold stories behind gospel music's greatest voices and the homecoming legacy that shaped Christian music for 6 decades, go ahead and subscribe right now. Every week, we bring you stories like this one, and next week, we're going inside the private conversations where former Gaither vocal band members talk about why they never called Bill Gaither their boss or their leader. They called him Dad. You do not want to miss that one. Bill Gaither turned 90 years old, having built something no one else in gospel music history ever quite managed to build. Starting with the very first homecoming video in 1991, recorded in an Alexandria, Indiana studio with a group of aging gospel singers who nobody thought audiences still cared about, Gaither proved that the hunger for this music had never gone away. It had just been waiting for someone to remember it. That first session produced "I Feel Like Traveling On," and the response from viewers was unlike anything the Christian music world had seen. Within a decade, the Homecoming video series had sold tens of millions of copies, and Gaither had become less a musician than a keeper of a living tradition. Gloria Gaither, his wife and creative partner for more than 60 years, stood beside every decision he made. She co-wrote the words to "Because He Lives" in 1971, during a period when the couple feared bringing a child into a world that felt uncertain and dark, and the song became one of the most recorded hymns in modern church history. The two of them together, Bill's instinct for gathering people and Gloria's gift for language, built a ministry that outlasted every trend in contemporary Christian music. Mark Lowry, who joined the Gaither vocal band in 1988 and wrote the lyrics to "Mary Did You Know" in 1984, brought humor and humanity to every homecoming stage he walked onto. Guy Penrod, whose baritone voice became one of the most recognizable sounds in Southern gospel during his 16 years with the vocal band, was in that Nashville room. David Phelps, whose tenor range had brought audiences to their feet from Atlanta to Glasgow, was there. Wes Hampton, who at 47 carried the next generation of the homecoming sound forward, walked in that door as well. And beyond them, 146 more voices, stretching across 5 decades of American gospel music history. The homecoming tapings had always been communal by design. Gaither never built them as concerts in the traditional sense. They were more like reunions where the cameras happened to be rolling, and the spontaneous moments between songs often moved audiences more than the performances themselves. From 1991 through the mid-2000s, the series produced more than 60 video projects, filmed in locations ranging from Carnegie Hall to the Holy Land, and introduced multiple generations of American Christians to artists they might otherwise never have discovered. What shifted in the final years was subtle at first. The founding generation of homecoming artists, many of whom had been recording since the 1950s and 1960s, began to pass. Jake Hess, who had shaped Southern gospel quartet singing for 40 years, was gone. George Younce, The cathedral quartet bass, whose laugh was as famous as his voice, was gone. Howard and Vestal Goodman, who had brought their raw Appalachian faith to the homecoming stages with an abandon that left nobody unmoved, were both gone. Each loss pulled something out of the room that could not quite be replaced. Gaither kept gathering people anyway, because that had always been his answer to loss, not withdrawal, but inclusion. He added younger voices as the older ones fell quiet, and the homecoming family grew even as its founding members thinned. But by the time the formal taping schedule wound down, something had changed in Gaither himself. People close to him noticed it. The phone calls got longer. The conversations turned more often toward what had been built and what it had meant, and whether the people who had given their lives to this music knew how much they had mattered. And then, one by one, the calls went out, not to a production company, not to a booking agent, but from Bill Gaither's own phone to each artist personally, with the same quiet request: come to Nashville on this night and bring your voice. What nobody outside that room knew, until the people inside it began to talk, was that Gaither had spent 3 months making those calls. He did not send an email. He did not have an assistant handle the list. He dialed the numbers himself, spoke to each person directly, and what he said was not complicated. He said he wanted one more night together, with no cameras, no merchandise table, no production schedule, just the people who had made this thing real, standing in a room and singing. Every single person he called said yes. When the room filled on that evening in Nashville, something happened before anyone had been asked to take a seat. Artists who had not seen each other in years found each other across the room and held on. Men who had stood on stages together for decades stood in a circle and prayed without anyone organizing a prayer time. The emotion that filled the space was not sadness exactly. It carried grief in it, because this gathering was in some sense a farewell. But it also carried something that felt larger than grief. Something closer to gratitude, pressed past the point where words are sufficient. Gaither walked to the front of the room before any music began, and the room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when the person everyone has been waiting for finally speaks. He did not give a long address. Those who were there said he spoke for less than 4 minutes, and what he said was that he had spent his whole life trying to create spaces where God could move, and that every person in that room had been part of that, and that he was grateful in a way he did not have adequate language for. He said he hoped they knew what they had given, not to him, but to the people who had sat in the dark of their living rooms and heard this music on the worst nights of their lives and found that they could keep going. More than a dozen people in that room were weeping before he finished the first sentence. The song they chose was "Because He Lives." Not because anyone assigned it, not because it was on a set list, but because when someone began to play the opening chord, every voice in the room knew where it was going and followed. Gloria Gaither stood beside her husband, while 150 voices filled that Nashville room with a song she had written more than 50 years earlier, during a season of fear. And the distance between that first morning she put those words on paper and this evening collapsed into something that felt, by every account, like an answered prayer. Standing in that room again, at least in the telling of it, you see what the Homecoming series always really was. It was never primarily about nostalgia, though nostalgia was part of it. It was never primarily about music, though the music was extraordinary. What Gaither built across 30 years of tapings was a community that held people through loss, through illness, through the deaths of friends, through the quiet erosions of age, and did it through the oldest mechanism the church has ever had: singing together in the same room, so that no one had to carry the melody alone. The gospel music world has produced its share of entrepreneurs and visionaries, but Gaither's gift was something different. He understood that the artists who had poured their lives into this music were not just performers, they were family, in every meaningful sense of the word, and family deserved to be gathered, honored, and held. That was what the Homecoming tapings gave, every year for 3 decades. And on that final evening in Nashville, with no cameras, no production crew, and 150 voices lifting a song about resurrection and hope, the thing Gaither had spent his life building was still completely, undeniably alive. Some things, built with enough love and enough patience and enough genuine faith, do not end, and the sound of that room is proof. Thank you for spending time with this story today. It is the kind of story that deserves to be told slowly and with care, and your willingness to sit with it means a great deal. If you are not subscribed yet, this is the right moment, because the stories we bring you here are ones that most channels walk right past. And coming up next, we are going inside something deeply personal. Former Gaither vocal band members speaking privately about why the word they have always used for Bill Gaither is not boss or leader, but dad, and what that single word reveals about everything he built. That one is not to be missed.